Hi guys, Miss Davis here, ready for day 5 of the Anne Frank series. Today we're going to read a few more journal entries in the adventures inside the secret annex, or shall I say perhaps maybe the lack thereof adventures inside the secret annex. So Anne's been there for a while. It's now September and things are starting to become stressful, for lack of a better term. Those of you who have been home with your families on quarantine for a while, I think that you'll pick up the major theme that's running through this next set of journal entries. But just in case, I will check at the end to make sure you see what it is. And again, same rules apply. If you are a student of mine, you can look for work in Teams. And if you're not a student of mine, you can look in the comments section below. For discussion questions. So, without further ado, today's installment of the Diary of Anne Frank. I put these pictures up so you can get some visuals of the inside of the place as I read. Wednesday, September 2nd, 1942. Dear Kitty, Mr. and Mrs. Van Daan have had a terrific quarrel. I've never seen anything quite like it before. Mummy and Daddy would never dream of shouting at each other. The cause was so trivial that the whole thing was a pure waste of breath, but still, everyone to his own liking. Naturally, it is very unpleasant for Peter, who has to stand by. No one takes him seriously. He's so frightfully touchy and lazy. Yesterday he was badly upset because he found that his tongue was blue instead of red. This unusual phenomenon of nature disappeared just as quickly as it had come. And today he is going about with a scarf on, and he has a stiff neck. In addition, my lord complains of lumbago. Pains around the heart, kidneys, and lungs are not unusual either. He's a real hypochondria. That's the word for such people, isn't it? It's not all honey between Mummy and Mrs. Van Daan. There is plenty of cause for unpleasantness. To give a small example, I will tell you that Mrs. Van Daan has taken all 3 of her sheets out of the common linen cupboard. She takes it for granted that Mummy's sheets will do for all of us. It will be a nasty surprise for her when she finds that Mummy has followed her good example. Also, she is thoroughly piqued that her dinner service is in use and not ours. She's always trying to find out where we've actually put our plates. They're closer than she thinks. They're in a cardboard box behind a lot of junk in the attic. Our plates are ungettable as long as we are here, and it's a good thing, too. I always have bad luck. I smashed one of Mrs. Van Daan's soup plates into 1,000 pieces yesterday. Oh, she cried angrily. Couldn't you be careful for once? That's the last one I've got. Mr. Van Daan is all sugar to me nowadays. Long may it last. Mummy gave me another frightful sermon this morning. I can't bear them. Our ideas are completely opposite. Daddy is a darling, although he can sometimes be angry with me for 5 minutes on end. Last week we had a little interruption in our monotonous life. It was over a book about women and Peter. First, I must tell you that Margot and Peter are allowed to read nearly all the books that Mr. Kufius lends us. But the grown-ups held back this particular book on the subject of women. Peter's curiosity was aroused at once. What was it the 2 of them were not allowed to read in this book? He got a hold of the book on the sly while his mother was downstairs talking and disappeared with his booty to the attic. All went well for a few days. His mother knew what he was doing but didn't tell tales until Father found out. He was very angry, took the book away, and thought that would finish the whole business. However, he had not allowed for his son's curiosity, which waxed rather than waned because of his father's attitude. Peter, determined to finish it, thought of a way to get a hold of this enthralling book. In the meantime, Mrs. Van Daan had asked Mummy what she thought about it all. Mummy thought this particular book was not suitable for Margot, but she saw no harm in letting her read most books. There's a great difference, Mrs. Van Daan, said Mummy, between Margot and Peter. In the first place, Margot's a girl, and girls are always more grown up than boys. Secondly, Margot has read quite a lot of serious books and does not go in search of things that are forbidden to her. And thirdly, Margot is far more developed and intelligent, shown by the fact of her being in the 4th form at school. Mrs. Van Daan agreed, but still thought it was wrong in principle to let children read books which were written for grown-ups. In the meantime, Peter had found a time of the day when no one bothered about him or the book. 7:30 in the evening. Then everyone was in the private office listening to the radio. That was when he took his treasure to the attic again. He should have been downstairs again by 8:30, but because the book was so thrilling, he forgot the time and was just coming downstairs as his father came into the room. You can imagine the consequences. With a slap and a snatch, the book lay on the table, and Peter was in the attic. That's how matters stood as we sat down to table. Peter stayed upstairs. No one bothered about him, and he had to go to bed without any supper. We went on with the meal, chattering gaily, when suddenly we heard a piercing whistle. We all stopped eating and looked at each other with pale faces from one to another. Then we heard Peter's voice calling down the chimney, "I say, I'm not coming down anyway." Mr. Van Daan sprang to his feet. His napkin fell to the floor, and scarlet in the face, he shouted, "I've had enough of this!" Daddy took his arm, afraid of what might happen, and the two men went together to the attic. After a good deal of resistance and stamping, Peter landed up in his room with the door closed, and we went on eating. Mrs. Van Daan wanted to save one slice of bread for the dear boy, but his father stood firm. "Well, if he doesn't apologize soon, he'll have to sleep in the attic." Loud protests from the rest of us, but we thought missing supper was quite enough punishment. Besides, Peter might catch cold, and we couldn't call a doctor. Peter did not apologize. He was already in the attic. Mr. Van Daan did nothing more about it, but noticed the next morning that Peter's bed had been slept in. Peter was back in the attic at 7 o'clock, but Daddy managed, with a few friendly words, to persuade him to come down again. Sour faces and obstinate silences for 3 days. Then everything went smoothly once more. Yours, Anne. So, a bit of teenage angst and rebellion inside very close quarters. Oh my. Next journal entry. Monday, the 21st of September, 1942. Dear Kitty, I'm going to tell you our general news. Mrs. Van Daan is unbearable. I get nothing but blow-ups from her for my continuous chatter. She is always pestering us in some way or another. This is the latest. She doesn't want to wash up the pans if there's a fragment left. Instead of putting it in a glass dish, as we've always done until now, she leaves it in the pan to go bad. After the next meal, Margot sometimes has about 7 pans to wash up, and then Madame says, "Well, well, Margot, you have got a lot to do." I'm busy with Daddy working out his family tree. As we go along, he tells me little bits about everyone. It's terribly interesting. Mr. Kufius brings a few special books for me every other week. I am thrilled with the cooped series. I've enjoyed the whole of Sissy van Markveld very much, and I've read Een Zomerzootheid 4 times, and I still laugh about some of the ludicrous situations that arise. Term time has begun. I'm working hard at my French, and managed to pump in 5 irregular verbs per day. Peter sighs and groans over his English. A few school books have just arrived. We have a good stock of exercise books, pencils, erasers, and labels, as I brought these with me. I sometimes listen to the Dutch news from London. Heard Prince Bernhard recently. He said that Princess Juliana is expecting a baby about next January. I think it's lovely. It surprises the others that I should be so keen on the royal family. I was being discussed, and they decided that I'm not completely stupid after all, which had the effect of making me work extra hard the next day. Oh dear, I certainly don't want to be still in the first form when I'm 14 or 15. Also, the fact that I'm hardly allowed to read any decent books was mentioned. Mummy is reading Herine, Vrouwen van Ketchenen now, which I'm not allowed, but Margot is. First, I must be more developed, like my talented sister. Then we talk about my ignorance of philosophy and psychology, about which I know nothing. Perhaps by next year I shall be wiser. I looked up these difficult words quickly in Koninen. I have just woken up to the disturbing fact that I have 1 long-sleeve dress and 3 cardigans for the winter. I've received permission from Daddy to knit a jumper of white sheep's wool. It's not very nice wool, but as long as it's warm, that's all that matters. We have some clothes deposited with friends, but unfortunately we shall not see them until after the war. That is, if they're still there then. I had just written something about Mrs. Van Daan when she came. Slap! I closed the book. "Hi, Anne. Can't I just have a look?" "I'm afraid not." "Just the last page, then." "No, I'm sorry." Naturally, it gave me a frightful shock, because there was an unflattering description of her on this particular page. Yours, Anne. Friday, September 25th, 1942. Dear Kitty, yesterday evening I went upstairs and visited the Van Dans. I do so occasionally, to have a chat. Sometimes it can be quite fun. Then we have some moth biscuits. The biscuit tin is kept in the wardrobe, which is full of mothballs. And we drink lemonade. We talked about Peter. I told them how Peter often strokes my cheek, and that I wished he wouldn't, as long as I don't like being pawed by boys. In a typical way parents have, they asked if I couldn't get fond of Peter, because he certainly liked me very much. I thought, oh dear, and said, oh no, imagine it. I did say that I thought Peter rather awkward, but that he was probably shyness, as many boys who haven't had much to do with girls are like that. I must say that the refuge committee of the secret annex male section is very ingenious. I'll tell you what they've done now to get news of us through to Mr. Van Jick, Travy's chief representative and a friend who has surreptitiously hidden some of our things for us. They typed a letter to a chemist in South Zealand who does business with our farm in such a way that he has to send the enclosed reply back in an addressed envelope. Daddy addressed the envelope to the office. When this envelope arrives from Zealand, the enclosed letter is taken out and then is replaced by a message in Daddy's handwriting as a sign of life. Like this: Van Jick won't become suspicious when he reads the note. They especially chose Zealand because it's so close to Belgium, and the letter could easily have been smuggled over the border. In addition, no one is allowed into Zealand without a special permit. So, if they thought we were there, he couldn't even try and look us up. Yours, Anne. Sunday, September 27th, 1942. Dear Kitty, just had a big bust-up with Mummy for the umpteenth time. We simply don't get on together these days, and Margot and I, we don't hit it off any too well either. As a rule, we don't go in for such outbursts as in this in our family. Still, it is by no means always pleasant for me. Margot and Mummy's natures are so completely strange to me. I can't understand my friends better than my own mother. Ah, too bad. We often discussed post-war problems, for example, how one might ought to address servants. Mrs. Van Daan had another tantrum. She is terribly moody. She keeps hiding more of her private belongings. Mummy ought to answer each Van Daan disappearance with a frank disappearance. How some people do adore bringing up other people's children in addition to their own. The Van Daans are that kind. Margot doesn't need it. She's such a goody-goody, perfection itself. But I seem to have enough mischief in me for the two of us put together. You should hear us at meal times, with reprimands and cheeky answers flying to and fro. Mummy and Daddy always defend me stoutly. I'd have to give it up if it weren't for them. Although they do tell me that I mustn't talk so much, that I must be more retiring and not poke my nose into everything. Still, I seem doomed to failure. If Daddy wasn't so patient, I'd be afraid I was going to turn out to be a terrific disappointment to my parents, and they are pretty lenient with me. If I take a small helping of some vegetable I detest and made up with potatoes, the Van Daans, and Mevrouw in particular, cannot get over it that any child should be so spoiled. Come along, Anne, have a few more vegetables, she says straight away. No, thank you, Miss Van Daan, I answer. I have plenty of potatoes. Vegetables are good for you. Your mother says so, too. Have a few more, she says, pressing them on me until Daddy comes to my rescue. Then we have from Mrs. Van Daan, you ought to have been in our home. We were properly brought up. It's absurd that Anne's so frightfully spoiled. I wouldn't put up with it if Anne were my daughter. These are always her first and last words, if Anne were my daughter. Thank heavens I'm not. But to come back to this upbringing business, there was a deadly silence after Mrs. Van Daan had finished speaking yesterday. Then Daddy said, I think Anne is extremely well brought up. She's learned one thing anyway, and that's to make no reply to your long sermons. As to the vegetables, look at your own plate. Mrs. Van Daan was beaten, well and truly beaten. She had taken a minute helping of vegetables herself. But she's not spoiled. Oh no, too many vegetables in the evening make her constipated. Why on earth doesn't she keep her mouth shut about me? Then she wouldn't need to make such feeble excuses. It's gorgeous the way Mrs. Van Daan blushes. I don't, and that is just what she hates. Yours, Anne. Oh my. The tension, the awful tension. we'll journal